Somewhere in the shadows of World War II, history lies a story never told in official history. A story about an ordinary man whose calloused hands and brilliant mind transformed one of the war's most iconic aircraft into something that defied all rules, regulations, and expectations. This is the story of how a mechanic forgotten by time created, without authorization, without permission, and certainly without imagining the consequences, the most lethal Spitfire to ever fly over the skies of Europe. But before we dive into this extraordinary journey, I need you to do something for me. If this story touches your heart, if it makes you see war differently, hit that subscribe button. And in the comments, tell me what time it is where you're watching. I want to know if it's dawn, morning, afternoon, or evening. I want to know when people around the world discover stories that should have been told decades ago. Now close your eyes for a moment and imagine England, 1942. The world is in flames. Europe bleeds under the boot of the most terrible regime humanity has ever known. English cities still smoke from the bombings of the Blitz. People sleep in London subways, praying for the sunrise. And in the sky, young pilots in their early 20s face death daily, knowing that each mission could be their last. It is in this context of desperation, fear, but also an iron determination to never give up, that our story begins. At an airbase in southern England, shrouded in the haze typical of a British autumn, a man worked alone in a dimly lit hangar. His name was James Aldridge, but everyone simply called him Jimmy. He was 38 years old, with hair already graying at the temples, hands that looked as if they had been carved from leather, and eyes that shone with an intelligence that no university had polished. But that sheer experience had sharpened to a razor's edge. Jimmy wasn't a pilot. He never would be. He was afraid of heights, believe it or not. An airplane mechanic afraid of flying. The irony wasn't lost on him, and he even joked about it when the pilots gently teased him in the base bar. But what Jimmy had, what no one could deny, was a deep, almost mystical understanding of how machines worked. He didn't just fix planes. He heard what they said. He felt their vibrations. He understood their metallic whispers. Before the war, Jimmy ran a modest mechanics shop in Manchester. He fixed cars, tractors, anything with an engine. His specialty, however, was making machines perform better than their creators had imagined. He had a gift, an inexplicable talent for seeing potential where others saw only metal and screws. When the war began, he tried to enlist as a pilot but was rejected because of his age and, ironically, because of his value as a mechanic. The Royal Air Force needed men who could keep planes in the air, not just another pilot. Initially, Jimmy was frustrated. He wanted to fight. He wanted to make a difference in a visible, heroic way. But over time, he began to realize that his hands could save more lives than his eyes in a scope. Every engine he tuned, every system he refined, every small improvement he implemented meant a pilot had a better chance of returning home, of seeing his family again, of living another day. At the airbase where he was assigned, Jimmy quickly gained a reputation. The pilots specifically requested him. They wanted Jimmy to be the last one to touch their planes before takeoff. There was something comforting in knowing those experienced hands had checked every detail, every component. But Jimmy wasn't just meticulous. He was innovative. And it was this trait that would lead him to cross a line no one expected him to cross. The Supermarine Spitfire was undoubtedly a masterpiece of engineering. Its elegant silhouette, its distinctive elliptical wings, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that roared like a wounded lion. But for Jimmy, the Spitfire had obvious limitations. He saw what the engineers at their drawing boards far from the battlefield didn't. He heard what the pilots said in moments of exhaustion after brutal missions. The Spitfire was fast, but not fast enough. It was agile, but could be more. It was lethal, but had the potential to be absolutely dominant. The problem was the engine, or more specifically, the way the engine was configured. The Rolls-Royce Merlin was a marvel, yes, but it was being operated within conservative parameters. There was headroom, as the engineers said. There was untapped potential. But exploiting that potential meant risks. It meant pushing components beyond their specifications. It meant, technically, violating the strict regulations governing the maintenance and modification of military aircraft. Jimmy knew this. He wasn't naive. But he also knew that the young men who flew these planes were dying. Not for lack of courage, not for lack of skill, but sometimes, just sometimes, for lack of a few extra horsepower, a few seconds less to reach altitude, a little more speed to escape an enemy hunter on their tail. It was one November night, after a particularly devastating mission in which 3 pilots failed to return, that Jimmy made his decision. He remained in the hangar after everyone else had left. The base was silent, except for the sound of the wind howling between the buildings and the occasional distant hum of generators. In front of him sat a Spitfire Mark V, the plane of Lieutenant Robert Davies, a young man of only 22 whom Jimmy had known well. Davies was talented, careful, and respected. But talent wasn't enough when 2 Messerschmitts had cornered him the week before. His plane was found scattered across a field in France. Jimmy stared at the empty Spitfire in front of him. This one would replace Davies's plane. A new pilot would be assigned. A young man full of hopes and dreams, who hadn't even finished shaving properly. And Jimmy made a decision that would change everything. He would modify that engine. He would unleash the potential he knew was locked within those metal cylinders. And he wouldn't ask permission, because he knew the answer would be no. The modifications Jimmy had in mind were complex and risky. First, he would adjust the fuel mixture. The Merlin was set to run on a conservative mixture, ensuring longevity and reliability. But Jimmy knew that by slightly increasing the richness of the mixture at critical moments, he could extract significantly more power. The risk was overheating, but he had ideas for dealing with that. Second, he would modify the supercharger system. The Merlin's supercharger was 2-stage, but the transition between stages was set to be gradual and smooth. Jimmy wanted to make it more aggressive, allowing bursts of power when the driver needed it most. Again, there were risks, additional stress on components, potential for mechanical failure. But Jimmy knew that engine better than he knew himself. Third, and this was the most audacious, he would slightly reduce the plane's weight, removing components he considered non-essential, and replacing others with lighter alternatives he would manufacture himself. Every pound mattered when it came to performance, and Jimmy was willing to compromise on small redundancies for gains in speed and maneuverability. He worked for 3 consecutive nights. He slept only a few hours in the morning, returned to his normal duties during the day, and when night fell, returned to the hangar to continue his secret project. He used only the minimum light necessary, taking care not to attract attention. The tools danced in his hands with surgical precision. Every adjustment was measured, every modification tested and retested. On the engine, he reconfigured the carburetor, installing slightly larger jets he had fabricated himself in a small workshop at the back of the hangar. He adjusted the ignition timing, advancing it a few degrees to maximize combustion efficiency. He modified the exhaust valves, polishing them and adjusting their clearances to allow the gases to escape more quickly, reducing back pressure. In the turbocharger system, he reworked the intake ducts, smoothing every curve, every transition, reducing airflow resistance. He modified the compressor blades, sharpening their edges in a way not found in the manuals, but which he knew intuitively would increase efficiency. When it came to weight reduction, Jimmy was meticulous. He removed some of the protective armor in areas he considered less critical, a calculated risk he knew no one would approve. He replaced metal panels with thinner ones in specific locations. Even the pilot's seat upholstery was replaced with a lighter version. By the time he finished on the 3rd night, it was past 4 in the morning. Jimmy was exhausted. His eyes burned, his back ached, but his hands were steady as he took one last look at his work. The Spitfire looked the same on the outside. The markings were identical. The serial number hadn't changed. But inside, this machine was something different. It was a Spitfire, yes, but it was a Spitfire that had been touched by something beyond conventional engineering. It was almost art. Jimmy knew the first test would be crucial. If something went wrong, if the engine failed, if the structure couldn't handle the additional stress, not only would he be held accountable, but the subsequent investigation would reveal his unauthorized modifications. Court-martial was a real possibility. Prison was a real possibility. But Jimmy looked at the photos on the hangar wall, photos of smiling pilots, many of whom would never smile again, and knew he had made the right choice. The plane was assigned to a new pilot, Lieutenant Michael Thornton, a 24-year-old from Scotland with red hair and a smile that lit up any room. Thornton was talented but inexperienced in real combat. This would be his third mission over enemy territory. Jimmy watched from afar as Thornton performed his pre-flight inspection, chatting with his squadron commander and adjusting his helmet and oxygen mask. When Thornton started the engine, Jimmy held his breath. Merlin roared to life, and Jimmy immediately heard the difference. The sound was slightly different, more aggressive, hungrier. But Thornton didn't seem to notice anything unusual. Neither did the other mechanics. He was too subtle for someone without Jimmy's trained ear. The takeoff was normal. The Spitfire accelerated down the runway, lifted off with its usual grace, and disappeared into the clouds along with the rest of the squadron. Jimmy returned to his duties, but his mind was up there with that plane, with that pilot. He wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. If he had allowed his arrogance, his desire to make a difference, to put a life at risk. The hours dragged on. The mission was supposed to last approximately 2 hours and 30 minutes. But as time passed and the planes began returning, Jimmy counted only 5 of the 6 Spitfires that had departed. His heart sank. Thornton's plane was gone. The returning pilots were agitated, speaking rapidly, gesturing. There was excitement in their voices. Jimmy leaned in closer, trying to listen without sounding too interesting. He heard fragments of conversation. Something about a chase, something about impossible speed. Something about Thornton doing something they'd never seen before. And then on the horizon, a dot. A single Spitfire flying low and fast. It was Thornton. It made a pass over the base at a speed that made everyone stop and stare. The engine sound was different, more intense, more powerful. It climbed vertically, a daring maneuver, before entering the landing circuit and landing perfectly. When Thornton stepped off the plane, his face was flushed with excitement. He was smiling but also visibly shaken. The other pilots surrounded him, asking questions, patting him on the back. The squadron commander approached, his expression serious but curious. Jimmy stood at a distance, watching, listening. And then he heard Thornton say the words that would make his heart both leap with joy and freeze with fear. "This plane is different. I can't explain it, but when I pushed the throttle all the way down, when I really needed it, there was something more. There was power that shouldn't have been there. I was in an impossible situation. 2 Messerschmitts on my tail, and somehow I just left them behind. The speed, the climb, the maneuverability, everything was better. I don't understand it, but this plane saved my life today." The commander frowned. He was an experienced man, a veteran of countless battles. He knew that planes didn't magically change. He ordered a thorough inspection of the aircraft. Jimmy felt the blood drain from his face. It was over. They would find out. All would be revealed, but then something unexpected happened. The chief mechanic assigned to do the inspection was a man named George Whitmore, a grumpy veteran in his early 50s who had worked with Jimmy for months. George was competent, but he lacked Jimmy's keen eye. He performed his inspection, checked the major systems, looked at the engine, and found nothing obviously wrong. Jimmy's modifications were too subtle, too deeply embedded in the plane's systems. Unless someone completely disassembled the engine, unless someone compared each component to its original specifications, the changes would remain invisible. George reported to the captain that the plane was in perfect condition, perhaps even better calibrated than normal. He attributed the exceptional performance to a combination of luck, pilot skill, and possibly a particularly good batch of fuel. The captain accepted the explanation, though clearly not entirely convinced. Jimmy took another breath. But he knew he couldn't stop there. The modification had worked. It had saved a life. It could save more. But it was also a secret he would have to carry, a weight that would grow with each passing day. Over the next few weeks, Thornton flew several additional missions in that Spitfire. And on each mission, he performed beyond expectations. He shot down 4 enemy aircraft, a remarkable feat for such a young pilot. His survival in situations where others would have perished became legend at the base. The other pilots began calling him lucky. But Thornton knew it wasn't luck. It was that plane Jimmy watched from afar, a mixture of pride and fear gnawing at his insides. He wanted to tell someone. He wanted to share what he had done. But he knew he couldn't. So he continued his work, day after day, keeping the planes in the air, keeping the pilots alive, but with a secret weighing increasingly heavy on his heart. And then came the unexpected invitation. The squadron commander called him into his office. Jimmy entered with his heart racing, convinced that the truth had finally been uncovered. But instead of accusations, the commander had a proposal. Thornton wants you to be his personal mechanic. He says he trusts you more than anyone else. And frankly, given his track record, I'm inclined to agree. Would you be willing to be solely responsible for the maintenance of his aircraft? Jimmy could hardly believe it. Instead of being punished, he was being promoted in a way. He accepted, of course. How could he not? And it gave him something he hadn't had before. Unlimited, unquestionable access to that particular Spitfire. With this new arrangement, Jimmy was able to further refine his modifications. Each time the plane returned from a mission, he made small adjustments, incremental improvements. He kept meticulous records in a personal notebook he kept locked in his tent. Numbers, observations, ideas for future improvements. It was his secret warrior engineering diary. But war waits for no one, and the challenges continued to mount. The Luftwaffe was becoming more desperate, more aggressive. New tactics, new planes, new pilots trained specifically to hunt Spitfires. Losses were mounting again. It was in March of 1943 that everything changed. A major operation was planned, a bomber escort deep into enemy territory. The risk was immense. The chances of casualties were high. And Thornton would be one of the pilots on the mission. The night before, Jimmy worked on the Spitfire until late, checking absolutely everything. He knew this mission would be different. More dangerous, longer, more demanding. He made final adjustments to the engine, maximizing efficiency without compromising reliability. He checked every screw, every cable, every system. By the time he finished, it was past midnight. He stood beside the plane in the silent hangar, his hand resting on the cool fuselage. And he did something he had never done before. He prayed. He wasn't a particularly religious man, but at that moment he needed to believe in something greater. The morning of the mission dawned gray and cold. Fog shrouded the base. The pilots were tense but determined. Thornton greeted Jimmy with a wave and that signature smile. Though Jimmy could see the worry in the young pilot's eyes, the engines roared to life one by one. The sound was deafening, a symphony of power and purpose. And then, one by one, the Spitfires sped down the runway and rose into the gray sky, disappearing into the clouds. Jimmy returned to his duties, but his mind was elsewhere. Hours passed. The clock on the hangar wall seemed to move with excruciating slowness. Other mechanics chatted, joked, and tried to maintain morale. But Jimmy was silent, lost in thought. And then the news came. Over the radio, fragments of communications. The formation had been attacked. There was intense combat, losses. The details were confusing, contradictory. But one thing was clear. It would not be a clean operation. As the planes began to return, Jimmy ran to the runway. 1, 2, 3, 4 Spitfires. All damaged, some seriously. But where was the fifth? Where was Thornton? The returning pilots were in shock. They had faced a larger enemy force than expected. The battle had been brutal. And then one of the pilots, a young man with a soot-covered face, said something that made Jimmy stop. Thornton saved us all. We were being slaughtered, surrounded. And he somehow turned the tide. The speed of that plane, the way it maneuvered, was like watching something otherworldly. He shot down 5, maybe 6 enemy aircraft. He gave us time to escape, but he was shot down. I saw smoke coming from his engine, but he was still flying when I lost sight of him. Jimmy's heart was in his throat. Smoke from the engine. This was bad. His modifications had made the engine more powerful, but also more vulnerable to damage. If the cooling systems were compromised, the engine could quickly, catastrophically overheat. Minutes turned into hours. Hope began to fade. The captain was already preparing the missing in action report. But Jimmy refused to give up. He stood on the runway, staring at the sky, waiting, praying. And then, as the sun began to set, tinting the sky orange and red, he heard it. Faint at first, but growing louder. The sound of a Merlin engine. But it was a sick, uneven sound, as if the engine were in pain. And then he saw it, a Spitfire, flying low, very low, black smoke pouring from the engine, sections of the tail missing, the landing gear apparently stuck in a partially extended position. Era Thornton. He was trying to land. But with that damage, with that engine failing, the odds were grim. The control tower was shouting instructions over the radio. Fire trucks raced to the runway. Everyone at the base stopped to watch. The Spitfire approached the runway, swaying, struggling. Thornton was clearly struggling with the controls. The engine coughed, nearly stalled, and then started again. He was too low, too slow. He was going to crash before the runway, but then, at the last possible moment, the engine gave one last burst of power. Just enough. The Spitfire cleared the fence at the end of the base by meters, maybe even centimeters. The wheels hit the runway hard, the plane bounced, hit again, and then began to skid, spinning out of control. Jimmy ran. He didn't even think. He just ran toward the burning plane. The fire trucks arrived simultaneously, spraying foam across the fuselage. The cockpit opened and Thornton was pulled out by urgent hands. He was alive. Burned. Injured, in shock, but alive. As the medics carried Thornton away, Jimmy stood there staring at the remains of the Spitfire. The plane was destroyed. The engine was a mass of twisted metal. The wings were riddled with bullet holes. The tail was almost completely ripped off, but it had done its job. It had brought its pilot home. Later that night, after Thornton was stabilized in the base hospital, Jimmy went to visit him. The young pilot was wrapped in bandages, but his eyes were clear. "Jimmy," Thornton said hoarsely, "that plane. There was something special about it, wasn't there? It wasn't just my imagination." Jimmy stared at him for a long moment, and then, for the first time, he told him the truth. He told him about the modifications, about the nights working in secret, about the risks he'd taken, about the fear and hope that had driven him. Thornton listened in silence. When Jimmy finished, the young pilot smiled. That same smile that lit up rooms. "You saved my life, not just today, but on every mission. That plane was a part of me, and you made it that way. You can't tell anyone else, of course. They would never understand, but I do. And I'm grateful." Jimmy nodded, feeling a huge weight lifted from his shoulders. Someone knew. Someone understood. But the story doesn't end there. Because what Jimmy and Thornton didn't know was that someone else was paying attention. The squadron commander was no fool. He had noticed the consistently exceptional performance of that particular Spitfire. He had heard the stories, seen the results, and he was curious enough and wise enough to do some discreet investigation. A week later, Jimmy was summoned to the commandant's office again. This time there were other people there. Senior officers, supermarine engineers. Jimmy felt terror freeze in his veins. This was the end. Court-martial, imprisonment. Maybe something worse, but instead of accusations, the captain began asking technical questions. About engines, about performance, about theoretically possible modifications. Jimmy answered cautiously at first, but gradually realized this wasn't an interrogation. It was a consultation. Supermarine engineers had their own suspicions about unauthorized modifications. They wanted to know what had been done. Not to punish, but to learn. The war was going badly enough that they were willing to consider unconventional solutions. Jimmy made a choice. He could continue to deny it, continue to hide it. Or he could be honest and maybe, just maybe, help save more lives. He chose honesty. He detailed every modification, every adjustment, every calculated risk. The engineers listened, asked questions, and took notes. Some frowned, concerned about the risks. Others nodded, recognizing the ingenuity of the solutions. What happened next was extraordinary. Instead of being punished, Jimmy was secretly transferred to a test facility. There, with adequate resources and official, though still highly classified, support, he worked with engineers to refine and test his modifications. They built prototypes. They tested the limits. And gradually, some of Jimmy's concepts were incorporated into later Spitfire variants, but not officially, not in the public record. The unconventional nature of the modifications' origins, the fact that they had begun as the unauthorized acts of a single mechanic, meant that the full story could never be told. At least not while the war lasted. Jimmy worked at that secret facility for 2 years. He never received any medals. His name never appeared in official reports. But he knew, and the few people who knew the truth knew, that his hands had helped shape the course of the war in small but significant ways. Thornton recovered from his injuries and returned to flying. He survived the war, shooting down a total of 12 enemy aircraft, becoming an ace. He always credited Jimmy for his survival, though never publicly, never in a way that would reveal the secret. When the war finally ended in 1945, Jimmy returned to Manchester. He reopened his workshop. He went back to repairing cars and tractors. Life went on. But he carried with him memories he could never fully share, stories that would never be fully told. Years passed. Decades. Jimmy grew older. His hair turned completely white. His hands, still skilled, began to tremble slightly. Thornton visited him occasionally. They drank tea, talked about old times, always careful with what they said, even so many years later. In 1982, at the age of 78, Jimmy suffered a stroke. He died peacefully in the hospital with Thornton at his side. Among his belongings, they found an old notebook, full of diagrams, calculations, and notes. The family couldn't understand what it meant, and almost threw it away. But Thornton recognized it. He took the notebook and put it away. And when he was old himself, when historians finally began to unravel the untold secrets of the war, Thornton decided it was time to tell the truth. He was 90 years old when he finally gave his interview for a World War II documentary. The cameras were rolling. The interviewer asked his standard questions about aerial combat, and Thornton responded politely. But then, at the end of the interview, he asked to keep recording. He had a story to tell, and he told her about Jimmy, about the forgotten mechanic who had broken every rule to save lives, about the secret modifications that had transformed an ordinary Spitfire into something extraordinary, about the courage that didn't involve flying or shooting, but involved risking everything to do what was right. The documentary aired in 2003. It caused a sensation among aviation historians and World War II veterans. Some were shocked by the idea of unauthorized modifications. Others were amazed by the ingenuity and courage. But all agreed on one thing. It was a story worth telling. The Royal Air Force conducted a historical investigation. They searched the archives, the old records that had been classified for decades, and they found evidence, buried reports of secret tests, memos about a certain mechanic with unconventional ideas, technical drawings that matched the descriptions in Jimmy's notebook. In 2007, 65 years after the events, the Royal Air Force did something unprecedented. They posthumously awarded Jimmy Aldridge the British Empire Medal for services to national defense. The ceremony was small and low-key. Jimmy's family, his grandchildren, whom he had never told about his wartime days, finally understood what the old man had done. Thornton stood there, now 94, in a wheelchair, but his eyes still bright. When asked to speak, he struggled to his feet, refusing help, and stood before the small assembled group. Jimmy Aldridge saved my life 7 times. Not once. 7 times that I can count for sure, and probably more that I never knew. He didn't do it flying. He didn't do it shooting. He did it with his hands, with his mind, with his refusal to accept that things couldn't be better. He saw young people dying and decided to do something about it. And when doing something about it meant breaking the rules, he broke the rules. Because for Jimmy, saving lives was more important than following protocol. The room was silent when Thornton finished. Many had tears in their eyes. And then, slowly, applause began. Not loud, not dramatic, but sincere. A recognition decades overdue of a hero who had never sought recognition. But the story doesn't end there, because the impact of Jimmy's work echoed far beyond that single Spitfire, far beyond that war. The concepts he had developed, the engine optimization principles he had discovered through trial and error, experience and intuition, became part of the collective knowledge of aeronautical engineering. Engineers who worked with him at the secret facility applied those lessons to the post-war development of jet aircraft. The supercharging modification techniques Jimmy pioneered influenced engine design. His approach to weight reduction, while maintaining structural integrity, became a fundamental principle in modern aerospace engineering. And it all began with an ordinary man, in a dimly lit hangar, making a decision he knew was technically incorrect but morally necessary. Jimmy Aldridge never flew, never fired a shot in combat, but his hands shaped the outcome of hundreds of aerial battles. His mind saved countless lives. Today, when you visit the Royal Air Force Museum in London, there's a small display in a corner. To a restored Spitfire, not Jimmy's, as that one was destroyed long ago, but one from the same era. And next to it hangs a faded photo of a man with grey hair and calloused hands, smiling shyly at the camera. A small plaque tells his story in a nutshell. James Aldridge, mechanic, innovator, unsung hero of the Battle of Britain. But words don't capture everything. They don't capture the lonely nights in the hangar, the weight of secrecy, the constant fear of discovery. They don't capture the moment he first saw Thornton return, safe and sound, and knew his modifications had worked. They don't capture the moral complexity of a man who broke rules not out of rebellion, but out of compassion. This is the nature of history. Heroes aren't always those whose names appear in the headlines. Decisive battles aren't always those fought in the sky or on the ground. Sometimes, the most profound changes happen quietly, at the hands of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Jimmy Aldridge was a mechanic. But he was also a visionary. He saw potential where others saw only metal. He saw possibilities where others saw only limitations. And most importantly, he saw value in each individual life enough to risk his own for their safety. Think about it for a moment. How many times in life do we encounter situations where we know what's right, but the rules dictate we should do something different? How many times do we let bureaucracy, fear of consequences, and worry about what others will think prevent us from doing what we know is necessary? Jimmy didn't let it happen. He weighed the risks, considered the consequences, and then did what his conscience told him was right. He didn't seek glory. He didn't expect recognition. He simply couldn't stand by and watch young people die when he believed he could do something to prevent it. This is a lesson that transcends war, that transcends aviation. It's a lesson in moral courage, about the difference between blindly following rules and thinking critically about the purpose behind those rules. The rules existed to ensure safety and standardization, laudable goals. But when those rules resulted in suboptimal aircraft that put pilots at unnecessary risk, Jimmy questioned whether following the rules was truly the most ethical choice. He didn't make his decision lightly. He wasn't reckless. Every modification was carefully considered, mentally tested 1,000 times before implementation. He used all his experience, all his knowledge, to minimize risks while maximizing benefits. And yet he knew he was taking a big gamble. A catastrophic failure would not only cost a pilot his life, but also destroy any credibility he had. The fact that his modifications worked so well wasn't luck. It was the result of years of experience, a deep understanding of mechanics and physics, and a natural talent that couldn't be taught. Jimmy had a gift, and he used that gift not for personal gain, but for the greater good. And consider also the loneliness of his position. He couldn't share what he was doing with anyone. He couldn't ask for advice. He couldn't seek validation. Every doubt, every fear, every moment of uncertainty, he had to process alone, in the silence of that hangar, while his hands worked and his mind wrestled with the implications of what he was doing. Imagine carrying that secret. Imagine knowing that if something went wrong, if a pilot died because of one of your modifications, you would have to live with that guilt for the rest of your life. And you couldn't even share that guilt, because admitting it would be admitting what you had done. Jimmy lived with that burden for years. And even when the truth finally came out, even when he was recognized, there are indications in letters he wrote later in life that he never truly freed himself from that tension. He always wondered, what if it had gone wrong? What if his modifications had failed? What if his arrogance, his overconfidence, had cost lives instead of saving them? These were the questions that haunted him, and they should have, because they are the questions any conscientious person should ask when making significant decisions that affect others. The difference between confidence and arrogance, between courage and recklessness, is sometimes a very fine line. Jimmy walked that line with remarkable poise. There's a letter he wrote to Thornton in 1972, 30 years after the events. In it, he expressed his lingering doubts. Thornton responded with a letter of his own, which is now preserved along with Jimmy's notebook in the archives of the Royal Air Force Museum. Jimmy, you saved my life. You saved my friends' lives. Yes, you broke rules. Yes, you took risks, but you did it for the right reasons and with the right care. You weren't reckless. You were brave. And there's a difference. Don't let doubt poison the memory of the good you did. The world needs more people willing to question, to innovate, to take responsibility when they see something that needs to be changed. These words perhaps sum up the essence of Jimmy's legacy. He wasn't a rebel without a cause. He was a critical thinker who, when faced with a situation where existing rules were inadequate, had the courage to seek better solutions, and his impact was real and measurable. Later estimates, based on Thornton's records and the recollections of other pilots who flew planes maintained by Jimmy, suggest that his modifications and exceptional maintenance likely directly contributed to the survival of at least 15 pilots in situations where, statistically, they should have been shot down. 15 lives. 15 young people who returned home married, had children, and lived full lives. When you consider their descendants, the impact multiplies. There are literally hundreds of people alive today who exist because Jimmy Aldridge, a mechanic afraid of heights, decided to break some rules in a dimly lit hangar in 1942. But beyond the direct human impact, there's the impact on engineering, on innovation, on the very concept of how we think about rules and progress. Jimmy's story has become a case study in engineering programs, in ethics courses, in discussions about innovation and risk. It raises important questions. When is it appropriate to deviate from established protocols? How do we balance the need for standardization with the opportunity for innovation? How do we create spaces where unconventional ideas can be explored without compromising safety? These aren't questions with easy answers, and Jimmy's story doesn't offer a simple answer. What it does offer is an example of how to navigate these complex waters with integrity, care, and courage. Jimmy didn't ignore the rules because he didn't care. He bent them because he cared deeply about their purpose, keeping people safe. When he realized that following the rules to the letter was, paradoxically, putting people at greater risk, he made a conscious choice to prioritize actual safety over procedural compliance. This is a crucial distinction. He wasn't being anarchic. He was being pragmatic, and his pragmatism was informed by genuine expertise and genuine concern. Today, in the modern era, we live in a world even more regulated, even more standardized than Jimmy's, and there are good reasons for this. Regulations save lives, prevent disasters, and ensure quality. But sometimes, perhaps more often than we'd like to admit, regulations become outdated or don't apply perfectly to specific situations, or impede innovations that could be beneficial. Jimmy's story reminds us that we need people who think critically about established systems, not to overturn them capriciously, but to constantly improve them. We need people who have the expertise to recognize when change is necessary and the courage to advocate for it, even when it's uncomfortable. But we also need systems that allow such voices to be heard. One of the tragedies of Jimmy's story is that he felt he had to work in secret. If there had been proper channels for proposing and testing modifications, if there had been a culture that valued bottom-up innovation as much as top-down directives, perhaps Jimmy wouldn't have needed to operate in the shadows. It's remarkable that when his modifications finally came to light, when he finally had the opportunity to work with official engineers, many of his ideas were validated and incorporated. This suggests that his intuitions were correct, that he had identified real improvements. Imagine how many other potential improvements have been lost throughout history because the people who identified them lacked Jimmy's courage or didn't have his opportunity. There's a profound irony in the fact that Jimmy's most important work, the work that had the greatest impact, was work he did in direct violation of orders and regulations. And when you think about progress, about advancement, about how humanity improves its technologies and systems, there's an inherent tension between following what's known and established versus exploring the new and uncertain. Jimmy lived in that tension, and his story suggests that sometimes, just sometimes, progress requires people willing to color outside the lines, to challenge the status quo, to take calculated risks for the sake of something bigger than themselves. But let's be clear about something. This is not a story that glorifies reckless disobedience. Jimmy was no cowboy. He was a consummate professional who, under extreme circumstances, made choices he believed were morally necessary. He wasn't seeking excitement or recognition. He was responding to a need he clearly saw that others either didn't see or couldn't address. And he paid a price. The stress, the loneliness, the perpetual doubt, it all weighed heavily on him. Being a secret hero is, in many ways, harder than being a public hero. At least public heroes receive validation, support, and recognition. Jimmy lived decades knowing what he had done, but unable to talk about it, unable to seek the validation that we all, as humans, naturally crave. There's a photo of him taken in 1975 at a veterans reunion at his old base. He's standing in the background, almost out of frame, while pilots in the foreground laugh and tell stories. He's smiling, but there's something in his eyes, a distance, a melancholy. It's as if he's there but not fully present, because he has stories he can't tell, experiences he can't share. This is another lesson from Jimmy's story. Courage has a cost. Doing what's right doesn't always lead to immediate happiness. Sometimes doing what's right means carrying burdens others can't see, fighting battles others don't recognize. But Jimmy endured. He lived a long life, returned to his workshop, to his family, to a simpler existence, and he found peace in that simplicity. He had done his part. He had contributed in whatever way he could. And when he lay down to sleep for the last time, he could do so knowing that his hands had saved lives. Isn't that, after all, the ultimate test of a life well lived? Not fame, not fortune, but impact. Lives touched. Differences made. And by the standards of what truly matters, James Aldridge lived an extraordinary life. Her story challenges us. It asks us, what would you do in her situation? If you had the knowledge and skills to make a difference, but doing so meant breaking rules, taking risks, potentially facing severe punishment, would you have the courage? Could you carry that weight? These are not easy questions, and there are no universally correct answers. Context matters, circumstances matter. But Jimmy's example gives us a framework for thinking about these questions. He shows us that it is possible to navigate complex moral dilemmas with integrity, that it is possible to be both respectful of established systems and critically engaged with their limitations. And perhaps most importantly, his story reminds us that ordinary heroes exist, that you don't need superpowers, high positions, or unlimited resources to make a difference. Jimmy was a mechanic. He had no advanced formal education. He had no political connections. He had no wealth. What he did have was skilled hands, a sharp mind, and a heart that refused to accept the needless loss of life when he believed he could do something about it. All of us in our own lives face moments where we can make a difference, perhaps not on a scale as dramatic as life and death in wartime. But in our families, in our workplaces, in our communities, there are opportunities to do good, to make things better, to stand up for what's right even when it's hard. Jimmy's story encourages us to seize these opportunities, to not hide behind excuses that we're not important enough, that we don't know enough, that we don't have enough authority. Jimmy wasn't any of these things in the conventional sense, but he had something more valuable. He had conviction. So as we conclude this journey through the life of an extraordinarily ordinary man, or perhaps more accurately, an ordinary man who did something extraordinary, let me ask you this. What will you make of Jimmy's story? Will it be just another interesting story you heard and then forgot? Or will it change the way you think about your own ability to make a difference? Because in the end, that's what all great stories should do. They should change us. They should challenge us. They should inspire us to be better, to do more, to not accept the world as it is when we can help make it as it should be. James Aldridge, the forgotten mechanic who created the most lethal Spitfire through unauthorized modifications, left us more than just technical improvements to an aircraft engine. He left us a legacy of moral courage, critical thinking, and a commitment to doing what's right even when it's difficult. And this legacy, passed on to you now through this story, is Jimmy's final gift to the world. Not the engine modifications, not the calculations in his notebook, but the example of his life. An example that says, you can make a difference. You must make a difference. And when you know what needs to be done, when you have the ability to do it, then you have the responsibility to act regardless of the obstacles. This is the story of Jimmy Aldridge, mechanic, innovator, hero, and most importantly, a reminder that the extraordinary often comes wrapped in the ordinary, just waiting for someone brave enough to unwrap it and let it shine. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere beyond our comprehension, the Lord God looks at stories like Jimmy's and smiles, because if there's one thing that defines humanity at its best, it's the ability to transform ordinary hands into instruments of salvation, to use simple talents for extraordinary purposes, and to find courage in the most unlikely places. Jimmy never considered himself special, but in the hands of fate, or providence, or simply love for humanity, he became exactly what the world needed at that particular moment in history. May we all, when our time comes, have the wisdom to recognize our moments of choice, and the courage to act as Jimmy did, with integrity, with care, and with the conviction that some things are too important to let pass without acting.